Why my talk tonight is primarily going to focus on the extremely rare, I would go so far as to say unique circumstances of Siegfried's composition. The fact that there is this enormous gap between Acts 2 and Acts 3. I feel that all the reasons why I think Wagner stopped working on the Ring, that he was no longer in tune with the subject matter, perhaps because of reading Schopenhauer, also because his life had changed so radically. He perhaps needed to get away and have compose in an atmosphere where he could concentrate more, which of course is what he did in Tristan. He starts Tristan still all in the hurly-burly of his life in Zurich, but then he goes and composes a very great part of Tristan all by himself in Venice, because precisely, I guess, he needed that isolation. Also, it's quite arguable that Wagner was indeed tired of the Ring. And there are perhaps certain elements in Act 2 that could manifest that. I perhaps go into that a little bit. One thing I think perhaps differently than Simon, I actually think that at certain moments Wagner thought that he probably would never finish the Ring. The initial moment was, and this is an extremely crucial thing, it's kind of glossed over a little bit in the timetable, but he stops the composition of Siegfried in the middle of Act 2. Actually, not exactly the middle. He stops it pretty much right after Siegfried kills the dragon. And then there's about a 6-week, 8-week hiatus, and then he goes back and finishes Act 2, at least in the original, just the piano score. I think that those 6 weeks were really crucial to the history of the Ring. And if Wagner had not, when Wagner laid down his pencil and started working on Tristan instead, because they were already getting all involved with each other. The earliest sketches of Tristan that we have are music that all ended up being in Siegfried. And there's a little bit of music in Siegfried, a tiny bit, especially towards the end of Act 2, that sounds like it's coming right out of the pages of Tristan. And this, by the way, in spite of the fact that when someone asks me, what do I consider to be the most extraordinary, the most unique thing about Wagner's music of all, my answer would be that each one of his works is so completely different from the other, and that he never, ever falls into the temptation that even the greatest artists always fall into of repeating themselves, especially repeating their successes. And Wagner never does that. He doesn't even do it within the Ring. Each of the Ring operas, to me, each of the 4, has its own sound, but he certainly doesn't do it within the other works. So he really does not ever imitate himself. So Wagner comes to this place where I think he really just feels hopeless. Maybe it's just a moment of great depression because of his marriage, or because he desperately wants to write Tristan, or because the hopelessness of ever getting a theater to put it on. Who knows? I mean, lots of reasons. And I think that what saved it was somehow his inner knowledge, perhaps, of himself or the importance of what he was doing came back and he finished the act. Because by finishing the act, at least there was some kind of completeness. And then, because the leap from Act 2 and Act 3 has a certain naturalness to it, which maybe I'll speak about in a minute, whereas actually coming back and finishing an act would not have had. That's all being said, I really sometimes wonder whether Wagner in 1860, let's say, after he had completed Tristan and was working on the new version of Tannhäuser for Paris, really thought in his heart of hearts that he would someday go back and finish this great project of his. I don't know. I don't think anybody can really know. It seemed so hopeless. Had there not been the great Deus Ex Machina of King Ludwig coming in his life, and had there not been this whole new stability, it's hard to say. But however it may be, he did come back 11 years later, and there's the famous conclusion part of the Ring. So the Ring, I guess unique of any work of art I know of, has this enormous hole in it, enormous gap in it. And what I'm going to mostly talk about tonight is how the music is different from Act 3 of Siegfried on. We'll concentrate on it and just touch on some things in Götterdämmerung from the music before. Before I start talking about how the music is different afterwards, I want to talk a little bit about how I think the music is before, so we have a way of comparing the two. Okay, just to throw out a very personal opinion, from a musical standpoint, and from sort of a musical technical standpoint, and by this I mean from how the music functions as part of the drama, as a reflection of the drama, and as a continuous reflection of the drama, as sort of a continuous, unbroken, completely durchkomponiert, through composed, without any divisions or any artificial divisions. I think that the greatest part of the Ring is the first act of Siegfried, notwithstanding any other reservations. Because, in spite of the fact that it's all three male voices, in spite of the fact that it has no love music, only a little tiny passage of extraordinary pathos when Mime tells the story of Sieglinde's death, and we hear sort of the shadow, a sad shadow of the little mystery of her life and her love with Siegmund. Somehow much more moving to me than all the love music in the first act of Valkyria. As hot and exciting as all that is, it seems so extraordinarily poignant. But independently of all that, the first act of Siegfried has this incredible sense that each musical phrase leads directly to the next one. And even when there are big divisions in scenes, like the whole scene between Mime and the Wanderer, which I'll talk about in my narration lecture, which is in a certain kind of way, a scene by itself. You could take it out and explain its form and give it sort of rules by itself, sort of like a set piece, in a way that Wagner's not supposed to be doing anymore. It nevertheless flows absolutely, I think, within the context of the act as a whole. That each thing flows absolutely into the next by the function of the words. In other words, the thing that causes them to move to the next thing is not some musical design, but the music is so fully and completely united with the words and with the theater, with the actions and the words, that it absolutely just follows it. And so, sure, at the beginning of Siegfried, when we hear the prelude and you have the drum roll and the bassoons, and we sort of picture Mime brooding over how the ring, you can sort of see all the things. He's brooding, and then he's thinking about Fafnir, and then he's obsessed with forging the sword, and the ring is obsessing his mind, and you just feel all this as the music just sort of tells the story, exactly what he's doing, and then how the sword comes in and what it's going to do. And then when the curtain rises and he's actually doing all these things, it's just this perfect continuity. It's like the music is following the actual thoughts before we even see him start, and he does all the way through. The Prelude of Act 2 does something similar with Fafnir. That was Wagner's idea. I don't think it's quite as successful in this respect. And Act 2 is not continuous in this respect. It doesn't have this absolute, it has incredibly gorgeous music, but does not have this extraordinary continuity of where the music follows absolutely all the time exactly what the characters are thinking and doing. And I don't think that in any other part of the Ring he quite gets that so perfectly, so flawlessly, so seamlessly. That's not necessarily to say that it's the best. It's because you could say it's not the most glorious, or maybe the most glorious music is more symphonic. To answer 1 second, if the music is symphonic, by means that the orchestra sort of takes over, and the themes, the content of the music itself is so glorious, so grand, so overwhelming, so completely catches us up in it, we kind of forget about the drama. And so, in a way, one of the biggest differences between the earlier Ring and the later Ring is that in the earlier Ring, and I think especially in Act 1 of Siegfried, which is, I would say, from a technical standpoint, where Wagner has kind of really gotten into it. He has absolutely mastered a technique that he started working on when he begins at Das Rheingold. This exact technique I'm talking about, of having the seamless music following at all times the situation, the character's thoughts, words, and the dramatic action in this completely seamless way. Using leading motives to remind us of things and to combine the things together, and using the unity of these motives as they develop themselves and transform themselves in such ways as to give it this kind of plasticity, this kind of constant changing of a single organic unity which is in constant growth and movement, which is what Wagner is seeking after. I think that Wagner's goals and Wagner's ideas about the relationship between music and drama change. I don't think, after Tristan, they're the same again. Tristan is already a different kind of work than The Ring. Not only does it sound different, it's a different kind of work. And Meistersinger is even more dramatically different. And the later ring, by which I mean Act 3 of Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, has much more in common, I think, with the world musically. Sort of I was going to say of Meistersinger, but also of Tristan to some extent. And it would be interesting in a longer lecture to actually talk about these relationships, sort of how Wagner treats the music as part of the drama, the music as something independent from the drama, the music as, for instance, in the earliest operas, as something which exists kind of on its own and intersects with the drama in such a way that it depicts it, or it goes with it, or it leads us into it, but that has a different kind of relationship which it does in traditional opera. Whereas in the early part of the Ring, Wagner really is trying to create music which is inextricably connected to the drama all the time, as our experience of the drama in time. Whereas in the later Ring, I think Wagner is more interested sometimes in sort of a grander effect. And it, I think, is a much more static. You said urgent, but at the same time, I think it's a more static view of theater in a way. A grander view, perhaps, but a more static view. And in certain respects, as I think I'll show technically also, a more traditional view. In a way, I'm not going to go so far as George Bernard Shaw. Of course, he has special pleading because he's upset with the later part of the Ring because it doesn't preach what he wants it to preach, and it doesn't say what he wants it to say. Therefore, it's weak. Of course, I won't go that far. I don't think the third act of Siegfried is probably the greatest act in the Ring. Actually, if I have to say that, and Siegfried is definitely my favorite opera in the Ring. I'll be on the record for that one. Comedy or not, it is a comedy, but not because it's comedy, but because I like the music the most. And because I think that the first and third acts in particular are successful in such different sorts of complementary ways. So let's talk a second, I guess, first about what these concrete differences are. I'm going to come to Simon's Symphonic a little bit later. I'd like to talk about something very related to what I thought when we were talking about the motives. It's not so much, the motives in the early part of the Ring, Lynn, can also be or was it you who said that the shorter? Yeah. They become shorter later. In the early part, they can be, I mean, for instance, this is pretty short. That's short, certainly, or shorter. It identifies itself very, very short. Whereas, what are some motives? There are fewer motives in the later part of the Ring, but that's natural. I mean, he's built up this whole repository. There's fewer new things. What are some motives of the later part of the Ring? For instance, here's one. It's about the same length, let's say. Or here's another new one. That's a new motive. This is a new motive, but it's actually a variant of an old one. Anybody want to tell me what this is? Brunhilde's Awakening, right? Which we only hear it we hear it at the beginning of Götterdämmerung, of course, and then we hear it when Siegfried is dying. Maybe. Maybe. Actually, what I hear is the Tarnhelm, because it's the same. The Tarnhelm. What if I just went? It's the same chords, in other words. It's just they've been stretched out enormously. Anybody tell me why Wagner would use the same chords that we associate with the Tarnhelm for the music that is the Awakening of Brunhilde? Or the beginning of Götterdämmerung, for that matter, which doesn't have to do with the Awakening of Brunhilde. when Siegfried remembers Brunhilde, he's remembering waking up Brunhilde, so that makes sense. Anybody have any word why that would be related to the Tarnhelm? Yeah? That's right. It's about transformation. That's right. Don't expect such hard answers. That's perfect. Thank you. It's about transformation. He said it's about transformation. Brunhilde is transformed. She's going from one state to another. The Tarnhelm transforms. They have some sort of magic involved. But here's another new motive in the later ring. We don't hear it in Siegfried. We hear it in Götterdämmerung. That's not especially short. I mean, it's related again to other things, but that's not so. Or here's another one. I mean, there are a certain number, but I don't think they're necessarily shorter or longer than the motifs from the earlier parts of the ring. But there is something that they are different from the other parts of the ring. Can anybody tell me what they are? There's something very, very different about any of the motifs I've just played from the later ring, with one exception. Forget about this one for a second. It's different. But all the other motifs, whether it's or that's a motive that comes from Siegfried Idle, but Wagner uses it a lot in the ring as well. I could give you more, but let's just take those. What about those motives that's different from or even there's something very basically different. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Yeah? That's actually true too. And I want to get into that. That's not what I'm getting at now. There is a musical difference in a lot of them. The later ones are typically more complete as melodic phrases and less incomplete yes, that's probably true. But that's not what I'm getting at right now. In other words, from that standpoint, if Wagner, when he's talking about the music he's going to write in the ring, talks about plastic. And what he means by plastic is malleable, constantly changeable, constantly alterable. The motives that come in the later ring are much less plastic than some of these earlier ones. But that's not what I'm talking about right now at this point. Something kind of even more basic. Tell me something. Okay. Now, as you know, I mean, after having done this for you guys for, 12, 13 years now, you know that I don't like calling motives by names very much. It's sort of because it becomes very limiting. It becomes kind of a game in itself. And because the motives are mostly changing and names are what they are. Nevertheless, let's forget about that for a second. If I play, we say, that's the sword. Okay? We all say that. I mean, we may not want to say it. If I play, we say, oh, that's Valhalla, right? If I play, we say, oh, that's Hunding. Or if I play, that's Siegmund and Sieglinde in love. Et cetera, et cetera. All these, right? We have very specific associations. They may mean a lot of things. The sword probably should be called Wotan's great idea, for instance. I mean, there's all sorts of things. But we have very specific, maybe in some cases it's very hard even to put into words what the association is. But we have very strong, firm, concrete, specific dramatic associations with the overwhelming majority of the motives in the early part of the ring. Okay, what about this one? Now that makes a huge impression when it first comes in. There's a big build-up. The climax of the Wotan Erde scene is the first appearance of this motive. What does this motive mean? I don't know. And I'll go further. I don't think Wagner cares. I mean, it means there is a range. It has to do with Siegmund and Sieglinde's love. And it has to do with sort of Siegfried and Brunhilde's love. And it has to do with it on some kind of grand scale, perhaps. Although, for instance, when it could be extremely intimate, when Siegfried in Götterdämmerung, Act 1, is secretly drinking to Brunhilde, and he takes the potion that's going to make him forget Brunhilde, in one of the horrible, ironic moments, it has to be in a production very clear that Gunther and Gudrun do not hear him say this. If they hear him say this, the whole story of Götterdämmerung is meaningless. He drinks this first drink to Brunhilde. Brunhilde dir, he says. It's very explicit. He sings. And then, of course, he drinks and he forgets her. Kind of nice. There you go. Dangers of alcohol. Dangers. Stay away from those magic potions, guys. The point being, when Wotan first sings it, if anything, we'd say, well, this has to do with the world-transforming meaning of this new love, which is going to transform the world. When we hear it here or in many other places, all it does is just love music between Siegfried and Brunhilde. I don't think it has, at least not for me, any kind of specific association. What about this one? It's another love motive. I don't know what it means. It's just a love motive. It's clearly love music. I mean, we hear it, the way it's treated and other things, it's clearly love music. But it doesn't have a strong association, a strong, clear, dramatic association. The music in the second half of the Ring, the music starting in Act 3 of Siegfried, is much less specific in its associations. Now, this is not only true, or not even primarily true in new motives. I'm using new motives because that's very clear cut. But after all, just by the very nature of things, the overwhelming majority of the motives when we start Act 3 of Götterdämmerung, of Siegfried, we've already heard them. I mean, it's just by the natural order of the amount of material somebody can stick into a 15-hour work where he wants to have the same material appear all the time. If it only appears at one little bit, it loses its function to some extent. But it's not just the new ones that don't have strong specific associations. Or if they do when we first hear them, which I think would be true of this one, lose it. They lose it. When we first hear that, it's so clear. Wotan says to, it's worth playing, says to Erda, the very climax of the scene, he says, happily, froh und freudig führe frei ich nun aus. You know, he says, I'm no longer worried about the end of the gods. I have willed it myself. This new love is going to transform the world, and that's when we first hear. So we certainly have that kind of association initially. But I don't think Wagner is particularly worried about maintaining it in the same kind of way he would have been earlier in the Ring. But if I look at just the passages right here, right around me in the same scene, I see lots and lots of places where showing that Wagner is no longer so directly concerned with the motives in the way he was before. Okay, well, you know that of course we associate with the Ring. That's a very clear-cut association. When Erda recognizes Brunhilde, when Erda recognizes the Wanderer as Wotan, always struck me as surprising that she doesn't see through it right from the start. So we've been hearing this motive, which is the motive of the scene. The sort of very often scenes in the Ring have one piece of music, which usually comes from someplace else, which sort of defines that scene. In this scene, it's which actually is just a very sort of heroic or dynamic form of. You all hear that, right? That's the same as. And when he calls Erda, arise, arise, that's the scene. Hear it all over. And it's just the love motive. It's just in sort of this new form. Okay, but later on in the scene, he goes. Now that, of course, that's what? That's the Ring, right? Now, no one is talking about the Ring. There's no reference to the Ring. The Ring has some very, very large symbolic meaning to it. And so you can certainly argue, find a way to explain why the ring motive should be there and why he should turn. Does it 3 or 4 times in a row, actually. But I don't think that Wagner is worried so much at this point in making, in distinguishing this motive means this and this motive means that. On the contrary, I think Wagner is taking a great pleasure, artistically, sort of as almost as a tour de force, in combining these things. There could even be symbolic meaning. Who knows that the ring is infecting even the idea of love as it first appeared. I have a friend who would certainly say that's exactly what it means, because he has a very revisionist idea of what the ring is all about. But with not just the ring as an object, but the ring, der Ring des Nibelungen, is all about. But that's not my point here. I guess my point here is simply that in the latter part of the ring, Wagner is no longer so interested in using leitmotifs as direct descriptions or as direct ties to the text. Whereas in the first act of Siegfried, almost every single second of the score, in very clear-cut ways, the music is illustrating or defining or explaining or giving sort of a Greek chorus. In other words, an outside significance. It's speaking from the outside. It knows everything, whereas the characters do not, to the music. But it's very easy to make a one-to-one correspondence. Not that you can say, this means this and this means that, but it's clear what it means. I mean, sometimes the meaning is not something you can put into very simple words. Whereas in the later ring, from the third act of Siegfried on, you can no longer do that. It is no longer this easy or one-to-one or clear dramatic significance. The leitmotifs are no longer used. Wagner was attacked by this. There's a rather famous, when I was a kid, very famous book, nobody reads it anymore, by Jack Stein. Does anybody know this book, Wagner? Jack Stein basically says that Wagner forgets what the motives mean and loses his direction. He's very critical of the later ring precisely for this facet. Another take on this whole thing is Boulez, who I think has a much more accurate and much more meaningful interpretation of what happens in this case. He says that Wagner has lived with, don't forget, this motivic material was probably all sketched out not only by 1853, but maybe a lot of it well before. I mean, I assume when Wagner started composing The Ring, he already had in his head, or probably on paper, we just don't have the paper that contains it, a good deal of material that was going to be the nuts and bolts, the stuff from which the ring is made. He didn't just come up, he didn't write it like he's the German. I mean, he planned these things. It didn't all just come on, by divine inspiration every morning. And he'd been living with these motives now when he comes back in 1869 for practically 20 years. By the time he finishes Götterdämmerung, 25 years. They don't mean the same thing to him anymore. And Boulez says this gives the music of the ring an extraordinary dimension, which perhaps no other single piece of music has, or no other work of drama has. And it's not a weakness, but on the contrary, a great strength that Wagner finds new value, new meaning, new significance in old themes. The confusion between, going back to the specific one that I was just playing, the confusion between the ring and Valhalla is right away we hear at the beginning of Rheingold. Just to remind you, the first scene of Rheingold, Albrecht has stolen the ring, and there's the change of scene, and it gets all sort of hazy, and we're supposed to go from the bottom of the Rhine to up high somewhere where Valhalla has just been finished. And he goes from a sort of, and then he sort of makes the ring softer and softer harmonically. And then, of course, we hear Valhalla. And Wagner forces us to realize that Valhalla is sort of a majestically dressed up version of the ring motive. And he reinforces it by, after hearing the complete Valhalla motive played, then Fricka wakes up Wotan, and Wotan is still dreaming, and what the music he dreams to is back to ring music again. So, and then when he wakes up and sees Valhalla, we have, So Wagner really reinforces this link between the Ring and Valhalla. And that's in the early Ring. And that's perhaps the most advanced moment in the Ring, if we talk about advanced just in terms of the sequence of Wagner's career, in the entire early Ring, that early, between scene 1 and scene 2 of Rheingold. Because we don't have anything like that again, really, not really, until the third act of Siegfried, when Wagner starts playing so loose with his themes and can transform anything into anything else. So he can transform into are just completely different music. But everything has become sort of grist for the mill now for his ability to transform. And what it ends up doing in terms of with the symbolic, since all the music in the Ring takes on symbolic or associative value for us, everything sort of becomes related to everything else. It becomes a very complicated and tenuous network, integument of interrelations, which is a lot less handy, can be extremely powerful, but much less handy, much less clearly definable than the earlier parts of the Ring. So it's not a question that it's better or worse, but it's certainly different. Now, where Wagner gets this technique from is largely what he'd already done in Tristan. Tristan is more this kind of piece. Most of the themes in Tristan, with very few exceptions, don't really have strong associations with anything in particular. I remember when I was a kid learning the motives, quote unquote, of Tristan and the libretto that came with the Furtwängler recording of Tristan. I remember this sort of the dismay or the difficulty the commentators had, and then it's the same with all the early commentators on Tristan, as they try to give names to the motives, like you can very easily. Probably shouldn't, but you certainly can in the Ring. And so they have like love's bliss, love's happiness, love's desire, love's ecstasy, love's longing, love's overwhelming power, the magic of love. You know, they're all love motives. I mean, come on. You know, it's all about love and desire. I mean, or they even went to the point of trying to figure out, is the opening of Tristan one motive or two motives, and what does the first part mean? The first part is Tristan, and the second part is Isolde. That's such balderdash. I mean, there's no possible way to defend that from the score. It looks nice on the paper. Wagner is not thinking that way in Tristan anymore. Tristan already makes the break. And the break, so people talk all the time about the break. Tristan is all this chromatic music. The music in Tristan sounds utterly different than the music of any other Wagner work, but certainly the music of the Ring. But it also works different. And it works in a way much closer also to the way the music of Meistersinger and Parsifal work, in terms of, yes, there are lots of motives. And yes, they mean something to us on some kind of basic emotional level. But they no longer, most of the time, occasionally they do, but most of the time, they no longer have very precise things where you say, that's the Rheingold, that's Valhalla, that's the spear. It's true, the spear means all sorts of stuff, and we hear the spear in 100,000 different ways in the course of the Ring. But still, if I hear, that's the spear. I mean, it's actually, in a certain kind of way, getting out of my own territory, it makes, I think, staging the early parts of the Ring very difficult. Especially in modern day productions, and probably is one of the reasons why so many directors have been tempted into sort of Brechtian vision, where you sort of, instead of telling the story of a work, you talk about it as if you're on the outside of the work itself, because you're constrained in a way that you're not. I mean, if I hear and there's no spear visible, or if I hear the spear and don't see a spear, if I hear the sword and don't see the sword, if I hear the Rheingold, when these things are actually tangible, the stage director either has to ignore the music entirely, or has to make fun of it, or at least, which is very often, I'm afraid, exactly what they do, or at least respond to it in some other kind of way. Whereas in Götterdämmerung, in the third act of Siegfried, or in Tristan and Parsifal, the motives belong to much more sort of a general emotional state, and so they could be reproduced in all sorts of ways. Is that clear? I don't think I said that especially well. Is that all clear? That's the problem of staging the early parts of the Ring is as a stage director, you're forced very often to make physical correspondences between what the music says and what what's happening on stage. And if you don't, it's ridiculous. To anybody's, to all concerned, it's obvious that you've ignored it. I mean, you may ignore it for reasons of your own, but you still ignored which is very palpable in the music. Whereas you don't have situations like that in Götterdämmerung, not on such a specific level. Sure, if they drink a magic potion and instead they're playing on a slide or somersaults or building a city or something, that's ridiculous too. But that's completely different. But there's no actual physical thing. And indeed, the magic potion is a good example because it's used in 100 million ways that have nothing to do with the magic potion. The most extreme example, and I'm sure I'll talk about this next year when I talk about peculiarities of the music of Götterdämmerung. But for instance, in the Waltraut scene of all places, we hear the Valhalla motive, which is usually she's describing the gods are in really bad shape and they're sitting around and as it goes. It's kind of a ghastly. But those harmonies, that's the harmonies of the Tarnhelm, but also the harmonies of the magic potion. That I don't want to get into the analysis, but in other words, he's transformed, or the Valhalla's become sick with the Tarnhelm and the magic potion. Why? Well, what does that have in any shape, form, or fashion to do with Waltraut and telling the story? About what's happening to Wotan and the gods to Brunhilde. Well, on a concrete level, it doesn't. It's quite easy on a metaphorical level. And that's the point. I guess the music in the later ring becomes much more metaphoric and symbolic and much less literal in general. In the early parts of the ring, if we hear a motive, there is almost always a very palpable association we have with that motive. In other words, we hear that and we associate it with something very specific. In the later part of the ring, it's shaded by all kinds of things, but it's still specific. In the later part of the ring, that's not the case. That we hear motives, it doesn't any longer have any kind of specific association necessarily. Occasionally it does. This one, for instance, I guarantee you anytime we hear that, somebody's talking about, thinking about, or referring to Brunhilde. That's yes. But most of the time, no. Much of the time, no. And as far as the physical thing, those would be special cases. For instance, at the end of Die Walküre. Now we hear, in Die Walküre, we hear the spear motive in one form or another 100 million times. We hear it more times. That's the talk that I was asked not to do anymore because it gets too technical. But we hear the spear motive in Walküre more times in one form or another, from the very beginning to the climax. Those are both forms of the spear motive. But when we hear it at the end, for instance, when Wotan is calling out to Loga hair, and he hits it on the thing. If Wotan doesn't have a spear, it's pretty ridiculous. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. And I have to say, in deference, I'm not sure I've ever seen a production when Wotan doesn't have it. Have you, Simon? No, Wotan, because it's just too concrete. Can you name me a place in the latter? Now, there is this, when Brunhilde is getting ready to throw the match onto the pyre, as it were, to set the pyre up for Siegfried, we also hear the same music exactly, but there's no spear there because Wagner's not using the motives that way anymore. The very reason why he uses the spear motive there is very metaphoric and symbolic and refers to a lot of other things, but it's not concrete in the way it was there. That's, to hear, when we first hear the magic fire music, you need to see a fire because it's a very concrete music. That's all I meant by that. Obviously, we don't have to see, every time the ring motive is played, you don't have to have somebody stand up and show the ring to the as a matter of fact, I don't think personally you ever need to see the ring. I'm not at all convinced that these productions where you have this, like the new one at the Met, where they make sure that you have this light specifically on it, so you have this gleamy thing on his finger. I really don't think that's either helpful or necessary. It's just that even though the ring motive, like the spear motive, has an incredibly large number of variants, and not so much variants as other music which is spawned by it, and therefore takes on its associative field. Nevertheless, it in itself has a very concrete meaning. We hear it, we associate with it. you know, when at the beginning of Siegfried, when we have, now actually, we've already heard that music with Mima, but there's no reason in the world we would remember that. But it's the outline. It sounds like the ring. Even though we don't know it, and we're not, this is talking about your subliminal versus immediate appreciation. I think that we are plunged right from the first note of Siegfried into this sort of morbid ring world. And we don't have to wait very long before we'll hear it. I mean, we hear it, you know. And Wagner very purposely has instruments outlined as it plays. As it goes through the ring motive itself. And, you know, it's Mima is brooding. They always call that the brooding motive, which is as good as any other name for it. And bassoons are very often associated with Mima, bassoons and violas. There's, you know, it sort of takes on all this general association, but there is something specific about it. Whereas in Götterdämmerung, if you start getting into specific associations, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. Even, for instance, actually, right away in this scene with the Wagner and Erda, at the climax of this scene, this is actually a good passage to play because it's very typical of the later ring. The Wagner says that their love is such, they'll be so joyful and free in their love that the power of the ring will become naught, and the ring will be nothing. And okay, so we hear. That's a wonderful. He's turned, you know. This sort of nasty, evil sounding motive into. Sounds all happy and joyous. He's made it diatonic, made it in C major. The ring was never in any key at all before. So it's this kind of, and now it's. That's the love motive, right? Of course, that's Siegfried. That's, of course, the love motive. Okay, so far, everything's great. In other words, the ring has been transformed into some object now which is almost delightful, almost wonderful, and there's Siegfried, and there's the love motive. The love motive is... That's that new motive. But there's something in there that doesn't belong. Somebody tell me what it is? Something in there that absolutely doesn't belong. Or it doesn't belong if we take motives to mean what they say. In other words, we take them concretely. Everything seems all wonderful. It's all turning into... Actually, most of this, the music itself could not come from the earlier ring because it doesn't sound like music from the earlier ring. But in a way, it could at least. But there's one thing in there that doesn't. And that is this. When he goes... This... Because that, so far in the ring, we have only associated that with Siegmund and Sieglinde. It's become a general all-purpose love motive in the ring. But that extension, that's theirs. And here he's not talking about them. What he says there is, her whom thou didst bear, Brunhilde will be awakened by the hero, and their wisdom's child will achieve a deed to set free the world. That's what he's saying. Big stuff he's saying here. It's the climax. We're going to talk about that, I suppose, tomorrow. It's the climax in a way of the whole ring, or at least what Wagner wanted the ring to mean. It's not, but at least it's, I think, at least what he wanted the ring to mean. And so what he's done here is he has taken a motive and freed it from its original meaning. We don't hear this very much at all, but we will hear it occasionally in Götterdämmerung in places where, again, it makes no sense at all, as it has no reference to Siegmund and Sieglinde. It actually even has no reference to love in middle of the second act of Götterdämmerung. Now, I have a theory as to why Wagner does it, but that's much too far-fetched. It has to do really with musical ideas, not with dramatic ones. And it takes the whole concept of what is a leitmotif on kind of a different level. But the whole point being is that it's whatever the idea is, whatever the reason is, it's much more abstract than it ever would have been in the earlier part of the Ring. So in general, I think that that's one of the big differences between the earlier Ring, in other words, up through the first two acts of Siegfried, and the later Ring, third act of Siegfried and Götterdämmerung, is that the leitmotifs are much less specific, much less directly associated with things in the drama, and become much more metaphoric and symbolic in their use. It's freer in their use. The motives themselves are often also sort of more complete as a melody, and more harmonically complete. For instance, something like you can't do a whole lot with it. You know, it doesn't really. You can't. It's not very plastic. It's not, and this is true of many of the. It's true of this. He does one thing with it, which has to do with where it comes from, though. That's in Götterdämmerung anyway. But in general, the new music in the Ring is, and that's in a way a good thing. In other words, Wagner is writing music to fit his new. He's no longer so interested in this sort of plasticity of the motives as he was in the earlier ones. He's not, because he's interested in the motives in a much more symbolic way rather than in the sort of plastic way that he was in the earlier part. Okay, so I'd like to go now to this what Simon's talk about, that the music is much more symphonic, and I think we all hear that when we listen to the prelude of Act 3 of Siegfried, it just seems grander and more complicated than anything we heard before. And I think that it will be kind of interesting to compare it to something somewhat similar in the earlier part of the Ring and just see how it is different. It certainly sounds different, but let's sort of see if we can sort of see how it's different. The most similar passage in the Ring to the prelude of Act 3 of Siegfried, I think, is the prelude of Act 2 of Die Walküre, which is also very complicated and also has quite a lot of different material in it. Let me just play, I'll sort of go through it a little bit, and we'll see what it is. I'm not going to play the whole thing, because it's very hard to play, actually. Okay, is it enough to start? You all recognize it, right? It's not from the, what do we hear? It's from the sword motive. It's a sort of agitated and extended form of the sword motive, and this. It's that basic love motive, but actually reminds us of something we haven't heard since Rheingold. When we very first hear that in a clear way, we hear the sort of, and then of course the descent into Nibelheim, which this refers to a lot, and also in Rheingold between Acts 2 and Scenes 2 and Scenes 3. It's just taking one isolated one, but later on it's going to be. It doesn't go through the scale like it does in Rheingold, but it's still this obsessive, this which is, don't forget, we've heard it for about 1 hour nonstop in Act 1 of Walküre when we hear this. So it's very fresh in our heads, and we associate it, the lovers are running. It's love, and it's and another element which will come clearer later. We get then a little bit later. This is just he goes through these two things over and over again. And basically he just develops these things. And at one point, finally, this. A lot of stuff going on there. You know what this? Anybody? It's beautiful. It's chromatic. Anybody know what what that reminds us of? Subliminally. There's your word subliminally. The act before, to the same notes exactly. The old guidebooks used to call that bliss or something like that. Anyway, it's love music from Siegmund and Sieglinde. And it's come back here in this. And underneath we have that same agitated, they used to call flight, but it's really just the love motive in an agitated form underneath this blissful stuff. And then, okay, so then after this sort of focuses it another way. We just hear, all we hear now is, it's kind of taken away everything but that rhythm. And that bum ba dum 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 bum ba dum, which of course is a well, the same rhythm we heard in Rheingold going down. What we call in music a dotted rhythm, the bum ba dum bum ba dum bum. In the Ring, it becomes associated with flight, with movement, with going someplace. So we'll hear it again in a second. And underneath it, in some performances you don't hear it clearly enough, but you should. You have this. The timpani and the Wagner tubas are playing. What's that rhythm? Bum, bum, ba-da-da-ba-ba-bum, ba-dum. It's Hunding, right? So we have this yum da bum da bum da dum da bum bum. It's really impossible to play on the piano, but you've got this. So all this love stuff, the sword is now concentrated just on the writing, and we are Hunding behind. In other words, the music is telling the story of what has just happened and what's going to happen. Very, 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 very physically in a way, very pictorially. And then out of this writing thing. It's the very first time we hear that. Of course, that's the Valkyries, of course, which leads us right into the scene. So there's a lot of stuff in this prelude. It's a really great prelude. I mean, it's got the sword, and it's got love, and it's got the flight, and it's got remembrance of some of the other love music, and then the flight kind of gets stripped right down to its basic rhythm, the dotted rhythm, and then we hear Hunding underneath it, and then out of the dotted rhythm comes another motive based on dotted rhythm. So it's that same rhythm, dum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum. Now it's just concentrated on the Valkyries. And of course, the curtain rises, and what do we see? We see, of course, one of the Valkyries. So it sort of led us from the past, from the previous act, the love music, sort of described to us what's going on in the interim to the people we just left, and then moves us into what's going before. So it serves as a preparation for the next scene, and as a bridge from what's happened before, and as a way to sort of tell us what's happened in the meantime. That the lovers, having consummated their marriage, or their whatever it is, are fleeing or in great distress. We feel their distress right from the start. And yet, all through that first part of it, we also hear the sword, which of course is the heroism, and which we already associate very strongly with the heroism. I mean, the great moment in Act 1 is when he pulls the sword out of the tree. So, okay, let's compare this now to very similar, but also very different prelude to Act 3, the very first thing that Wagner writes after he comes back to the Ring. So, what do we hear here? Okay, stop for a second. I'm going to play it all eventually, but so we have the first thing. We have that same dotted rhythm we had before. Now it's really persistent, but just. Also, it's in 4, not in 3, like it was, which makes it sort of even more persistent because it's 4 is symmetrical. We experience music in 4 in a very different way than we experience music in 3, which is asymmetrical. That's why I like the difference between a polka and a waltz. One is very solid, the other is always sort of has something up in the air, and this is in 4. It's very solid. So we have that obsessive rhythm, which we associate by this time with things in agitation, things in movement, flight, they used to call it. That's as good a name as any, why not? It doesn't matter, but we certainly have a strong association with this rhythm with agitation. And what's underneath that? So what's that? Anybody want to say what is that? What that reminds you of? You've certainly heard it before. Right? When she first comes out of the ground. And scene 4 of Das Rheingold. It's Erda. It's pretty straightforward. Erda, sure, Erda. It's working. It's not doing it in the same order, but in that up to here, it's doing the same thing that the one in Valkyria did. So far, it's just got this agitation, moving, which is very sudden because we haven't heard anything like this. One of the things, of course, which is different is whereas, the prelude of Act, that's the same in a way, the same and different. This feeling of extraordinary agitation and turmoil that we hear in the prelude to Act 2 of Valkyria is completely different from any of the music we heard in Act 1. But it grows out of it. Whereas this, we haven't heard anything like this in a long time. Acts 1 and 2 of Siegfried don't have anything like this. Because they belong to the world of Siegfried. They belong to the world, if we want, of comedy. And this is clearly the world of tragedy again. I mean, since our ears tell us that, whatever else. But still, we recognize this music and it's certainly leading us into the next scene. The next scene is going to be with Erda. Here we are hearing Erda. So what is this? When he goes... What's... That's usually how it ends when he does it by itself, but here he doesn't end it. Well, the old books used to call that Wotan's frustration. Wotan's will frustrated. It's as good a name as any. Let's leave it with that. Why not? And combining it with Erda, by the way, is something he's already done in the second act of the Valkyria. That's in Wotan's monologue towards the end when he's talking about his extraordinary frustration. He can't get out. He can't create a free hero. He can't solve his problems. He's a slave. As he gets more and more agitated, it's more based on this. Well, this is a direct repeat of that. So far, all of this music is just basically conjuring up that, except in a much more, instead of, for instance, when we hear it in the second act of Valkyria, it's the accompaniment is, that's the accompaniment figure. Now it's, very much continuous. Okay, then we hear something different. Okay, so what's all that? The spear. It's Wotan's spear. Okay, now he's done it, and he's doing it in something which he's actually never. He's done only in a different. He's done it already, actually. I was going to say he's never done it before quite like this, but he has sort of in the Wagner scene in Act 1. He's doing a canon. Everybody know what a canon is in music? If I call something a canon, do you know what that is? Okay, a canon is when it goes on top of itself. When you do part of it, you don't finish it. You go part of the way, and then you start doing it again at the same time. Or you could do it. It's like a round. A round is a kind of canon. A round is a certain very specific kind of canon. So we have. We keep hearing it come in over and over and over. It just reinforces it. It makes it seem particularly symphonic, actually, because it seems very it's a very abstract way to treat a motive, to just do it on top of itself over and over again. Okay, so then what do we hear? what's all this? It's kind of a lot going on. Great stuff, right? Okay, first thing we have. It's going up and down. We've heard that already in the scene with Erda and Rheingold. She goes up. It's all the nature of music, but anyway, it goes up, minor, we associate with Erda, comes down, she says, the fall of the gods will surely come, right? She talks about the fall of the gods. We hear that going down, we have association with the fall of the gods. So it's coming up and down. So we have the Erda, the fall of the gods, all mixed up. Makes perfectly good sense. What else is happening here? What are we hearing? This, by the way, is the first thing which I don't think we would have heard in the earlier ring. What are those chords? You know bells. What is it? It's the Wanderer. It's the Wanderer. Well, of course. No, again, this is not abstract. This is all pretty concrete. What's kind of abstract is how he's layering all this together. Having the spear on top of itself and the riding, continuing the bump it up, bump it up, bump it up, bump, and Erda going up and the fall of the gods going down, and it's all being harmonized to the Wanderer. Right. So it's got, the elements are still concrete like they were in the Prelude of Act 2 of Valkyria. There's more of them, but it's not that different. What's different is he's very sort of abstractly just layering them on top of each other. He's being very symphonic, to use your word. In other words, he's being very much like Beethoven would be, although even perhaps more so. And I'm not, I could, well, later on, we'll hear even more. I mean, let me move a little bit. After all of this building up and building up, we hear, which is the music we hear when Albert kisses the ring. Those exact chords in the same key and everything. So that's often called the power of the ring. It's just a form of one of the many, that basically painful, woeful, using an old-fashioned word, thing here at the very climax of this most dramatic and symphonic of all the preludes, you know. We still hear that riding. Now it's played by 8 horns going bump it up, bump it up, bump it up, and it's very, very loud and impressive, yeah? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was written between the second and the third act. Where in the third act do you see the greatest reflection of Tristan's work in the ring and how it's conceived? Only, you don't. Only in this abstract, the fact that he uses these things much more symphonically. This kind of treatment, no. Because there's a tremendous amount of dissonance in the ring, in the last part of the ring. I mean, all you have to do is, for instance, take, okay, this idea, this is a good sequitur. It's pretty dissonant, right? It's definitely, and that's from Das Rheingold. I'm just playing it as it hears, and it hasn't changed. It's the same. That's exactly the same music. It's just all dressed up now in very, very fancy orchestra. In Götterdämmerung, however, we'll hear that same. We'll hear it as. Now that chord he would not have, could not have written in the earlier ring. Now whether it's because of Tristan or not, but the chord like. If I play it like that, that's as dissonant as it gets. Yeah, I mean, that's a sharp chord. But that's a chord that Beethoven and Bach write all the time. It's called the diminished seventh chord. There's nothing strange about it. It's just very sharp, very strong. But he writes it, you know. But what it is that you wouldn't hear in the earlier ring. That's for sure. But I don't know if it's because he's written Tristan. Tristan, you have chord. But the thing in Tristan is not the individual chords. I mean, we talk about that chord all the time. But it's the way that they go from one dissonant chord to another dissonant chord to another dissonant chord without any clear-cut resolution. In the ring, it's even this chord. It always resolves. Even when he does even weirder thing, in the second act of Götterdämmerung, when it goes... This is the 20th century already, but at least it's clear. I mean, it's just extremely dissonant. Whether it has anything to do with Tristan or not, I don't know. I do hear lots of echoes of Tristan in the ring. Now, I'll play some in a second. But I hear them in the music just before he wrote Tristan, not after. After Wagner, this is to me, Tristan, from an artistic standpoint, is Wagner's most successful work, and he knew it. I mean, let's just not kid ourselves. Whether we like Tristan, whether it's our favorite, this was the work that was the most completely, entirely, uniquely different and successful. And yet, after he finished it, he never goes back to it. He quotes it. He quotes it in third act of Meistersinger. You know, when King Mark says he wouldn't be like, don't you know a story of Tristan? It is old. I don't want to be like King Mark. But and he quotes it like something which already exists independently. But Wagner is able to. Even though he's had this enormous success, the music closest to Tristan that Wagner wrote actually is the second act of Parsifal. That has echoes. And that could be because that music might have been actually originally conceived at the same time as Tristan. Don't forget that when Wagner was writing Tristan, he started having ideas of having Amfortis visit the wounded Tristan in Act 3. Now, that seems unimaginable to us now. But so Amfortis' music has a lot of for instance, of Tristan-y sounding stuff to it to me, but it doesn't sound like Tristan. In just a second, I'll play a couple places where I think I hear shades of Tristan coming into the music, but I don't afterwards. That's kind of amazing, but I don't. I hear Meistersinger. I'll play some of that too. For instance, all that stuff that sounds like Meistersinger to me. Very diatonic. All the C major at the end of this opera, it sounds to me very much like a composer who's just finished Meistersinger. Anyway, going on to this. Okay, so we have, and then we have. It's kind of amazing chords, aren't they? That's. They usually call magic sleep, the music we hear when Wotan puts Brunhilde to sleep. Well, exactly why we should hear that here, it's not entirely clear to me at all, but it's a good climax. And we'll hear it again. Wagner certainly seems to like this climax, having a big climax and then having it come down on this. Because, for instance, later on in this same act, Siegfried's going to go through the fire. In this big, big climax, Siegfried going to the fire, it's the same chords. This, of course, is the magic sleep again. He uses it at the climax of the prelude of Act 3. He uses it again when Siegfried goes to the fire. But he uses it also again at the very end of Götterdämmerung. At the end of the immolation scene, when the whole walls come tumbling down, we'll hear the same thing again. Why does he use it? I don't know. It works. But again, it's a very symphonic and abstract use of motivic material that he would not have done before. So I think it's very similar to the prelude to Act 2 or very analogous to the prelude to Act 2 of Die Walküre. But it's also very different. It's very much more sort of abstract and independently, thinking of it almost as if he's writing a symphony based on these themes that he has that have sort of general associations, but he's not so necessarily worried about what they mean or why he's using them. But it makes this whole great big sort of enormous canvas. And he just piles them up one on top of the other with this, great virtuosity. There is a side product of this, however, which is maybe partly accidental, partly fortuitous, and partly very planned on Wagner's part. Boulez would certainly say so. That these motifs that we've heard that before we had more or less precise associations with, even if we hadn't thought about them, we just associate them with things. Now, as we hear them in these new contexts, start changing their association. And I just want to give you, to me, one of the most fantastic examples of this, which isn't too, I hope isn't too loud, which when we have that fantastic scene between Siegfried and the Wanderer, which of course leads to they're having, Siegfried manages to get the Wanderer really angry, and the Wanderer challenges him with a spear, and Siegfried breaks it. Of course, in a way, it has to happen. I mean, the Wanderer has set it all up at the end of Wotan has set it up at the end of Valkyria when he says, if he who fears my spear will never go through the fire. So in a way, he's kind of set it up. But nevertheless, it's one of these scenes where, you know, he does and he doesn't. He knows that Siegfried has to break his spear, I guess, or at least has to defy his spear. But at the same time, he's still Wotan, and this is still his spear. And this is still some young guy who you know, owes everything to me, and he has no gratitude at all, damn it. And, you know, so it's one of those combined things. So, you know, when the fire first comes up again, we hear, you know, the magic fire music. That's all great. And then when Siegfried starts answering him, says, "Go back, you prattler." I love that word. What does that mean? You babbler, I guess. That's something we haven't actually, all that's music that we've heard before. Okay, that of course is Siegfried. But what's this? That's called the Rhine, right? Rheingold, Rheingold. Okay, same chord, same everything. Okay. We're going to hear a lot of, I find this particular combination to be extraordinarily exciting. Okay, so this is the forest bird, and this is the Rhine Maiden's joy, right? Rheingold, Rheingold, and of course is Siegfried. Later on, we're also going to hear. You actually heard it there, but it's so hard to hear. It's not really clear. You also hear. We associate with Brunhilde asleep. So you have a combination of the Call of the Rheingold, the Forest Bird, Siegfried. Well, Siegfried first. Let's get them in order. Siegfried, then the Call of the Rheingold, the Forest Bird. It's there. It's in great variation, but later on, the Brunhilde asleep, all combined. And I guess you can, except for the Rheingold, it would be very hard to make any kind of concrete justification for why the Call of the Rheingold should be heard there. Oh, I guess somebody probably did. They said, well, Siegfried's bearing the ring now. So maybe the fact that he's bearing the ring gives something like that. I don't know. It's happy, isn't it? It's happy. This just sounds good and happy. And the combination is extremely exciting and felicitous. And he'll use it again in Gutter. By the time you get to Götterdämmerung, it's a set thing. When Hagen will tell Gunther and Gutrune about Brunhilde being surrounded by the fire, we'll hear the Forest Bird and the Call of the Rheingold, and we don't hear Siegfried actually, but we hear those two together. It's become sort of a combination. So it's, in other words, it doesn't have any concrete. You can't say this means this means that. But he's put together material from the past in a fantastically felicitous way, and it actually ends up taking on a meaning. I can't hear that combination of motives without thinking about Siegfried going through the fire. To me, that's this music. This is music that has to do with Siegfried going through the fire. It's made up of various components, some of which fit. Fit, by fit, I mean I can say they concretely make sense there, some of which don't. but nevertheless, it's taken on a new association. So in a way, perhaps Wagner no longer is so worried when he comes back 15 years later or 12 years later with his music, exactly what they meant when he composed before, or maybe he is. But in any event, it takes on new meanings, sort of a freer, much more generally metaphoric, or for instance, this is very specific. It's the joy the Rhine maidens have, over the Rhine, over the Rheingold. And even when we hear it in Siegfried, when he takes the Rheingold out, we hear it's, he's just come out of the cave. The association is still very clear. We immediately remember the Rhine maidens and their joy over the Rheingold. Here's Siegfried taking the Rheingold out of the cave, now in the form of the ring. But here, of course, there's no longer that any concrete, but it's joyful. So it's gone from being very specific to something very sort of general and metaphoric. And I think that's a very basic difference between the earlier ring and the later ring. And these very free combinations of bits of motives is something which is very characteristic of the later ring. We do have it in the earlier ring too. And when I talk about the narration scenes, I'll talk about those also. But Wagner becomes extremely free in putting together little bits and pieces of things in ways that sound great together and end up taking on new meaning independently of what they originally meant. It doesn't have to have necessarily any really clear-cut one-to-one meaning. Okay, I'm almost finished. I just wanted to point out one other difference between the later ring and the earlier ring, which is the later ring is also much, much more conservative in some ways. The later ring contains many passages of kinds of operatic music which Wagner in his earlier period, when he first started the ring, had completely eschewed, avoided. It's kind of ironic that Simon is absolutely right, that one of the reasons that Wagner was so intent on writing Tristan, eluding himself that it would be a easily performable work, was that he was very upset by that Germany was getting to know his music, the things that he basically disowned. And yet some of the latest parts of the ring actually kind of revisit in a new way some of the earlier operatic forms that Wagner had once used and had then completely abandoned in the early parts of the ring. One of them is a kind of operatic convention of having people sing together and having sort of grand statements made together, and with what we call in music also these grand cadences. Cadence just means closing. We have that, for instance, here. When after Siegfried has awakened Brunhilde, and she first has her one of the great moments in all of music, I think, when she awakens and greets the sun. And then they start singing together, and he hails his mother. We have, and she answers. And then we have this, and they sing. They're singing all this together. She even has a trill. It's a big, glorious cadence. Well, I mean, in itself, this George Bernard Shaw would say too, in itself, this could come out of, I won't say Meyerbeer, but certainly Verdi, or this is very conventional operatic, having the two heroes come together and sing this cadence together, complete with the trill and the soprano part. The very end of Siegfried that you played for us, I mean, which is certainly manic and glorious and very, very beautiful. It's also extremely conventional. I mean, just incomparably conventional in the sense that it sounds like stuff that fits within all the rules of original opera. And we no longer have, in these cases, when Götterdämmerung is accused of being conventional, I'm usually the first to defend it, because a lot of the stuff that it's accused of, for instance, the use of the chorus, the use of old-fashioned operatic conventions like a duet of the Oath of Blood Brotherhood, and then the trio of Vengeance. I mean, every Italian opera has a trio of Vengeance. Every grand opera by Meyerbeer has oaths where people are taking their blood and singing together in thirds, and singing, these great cadences together, and their voices matching and stuff. This is all good old-fashioned thunder and blood and gore Italian opera stuff. But I can defend it in Götterdämmerung to some extent, it doesn't need to be defended, by the way. It's all wonderful, exciting music. But you could also say that it's all artificial, and it's intended to be artificial up to a point, because it's all been absolutely manufactured by Hagen. I mean, yes, they're making a blood brotherhood oath, but he's kind of set up the whole situation. It's sort of I think we're supposed to feel the artifice of the scene. We're supposed to feel, I think, even the artifice of the Vengeance Trio, although perhaps less so. But there's no justification of the sort for the very conventional music of some of the love duet here in Siegfried, as compared to the love duet in Die Walküre, the first act of the Walküre, where the singers just basically pour out their emotions in a very naturalistic way. This is a much less naturalistic love duet. Now, don't get me wrong. I love this duet, and I love the one in Götterdämmerung perhaps even more. But they no longer have this sort of naturalistic flow. Remember when I said that I thought that Act 1 of Siegfried was the greatest act in The Ring because it has this incredible ability to flow completely naturally, as it were, as the music mirrors and brings to life the words, the action, the thoughts, the significance of the characters and what they're doing and thinking. That's not the case in these duets. It's much more formalistic, much more generalized, much more broad scale. Now, it's not that one is better than the other, but the former is more unique to The Ring. But the latter is unique to The Ring because it's sort of the hybrid. It contains elements of both worlds. So the later Ring is a grander world than the earlier Ring. It's a more symphonic world. It's a more abstract world. It's not as perhaps fresh and naturalistic, if I can use that term, as the first act of Siegfried, for instance, or just the earlier Ring in general. What's miraculous about The Ring is that in spite of this enormous gulf, sometimes seems almost like an abyss, that it works incredibly well. As not even as two different experiences. I mean, it's true that when I go back in the theater after Act 2 of Siegfried and Act 3 starts, I'm very conscious, I think, as we all are, of being in a different world. But at the end of Act 3 of Siegfried, I feel manically joyous. And at the end of Act 2 of Siegfried, I feel manically joyous. And at the end of Act 1 of Siegfried, I feel, if anything, even more manically joyous. So somehow, in spite of the difference, he's managed to keep our sense of extraordinary joy. Any questions? We have to... Oh, no, we have a little bit of time. That's great. I'll address, yeah?
I mean, inherent in both yours and Jeffrey's talk is that Wagner composed... I'm sorry, yours and Simon's talk. Mm-hmm. Is that Wagner composed... I mean, the importance of this interruption, it hangs on Wagner composed in the order that the drama plays out, which I think is largely correct. But, I mean, do we know that's what actually happened? I mean,
we don't know exactly. For instance, there's a bunch of things that we... when I first started doing Wagner scholarship and planned to write my dissertation, my original plan was to write on exactly what we're talking about, on what of the new music that occurs, or at least the new things that occur in the later Ring, Wagner had already sketched or planned in the earlier Ring. And I ran into a brick wall. I was unable to find anything. I mean, not that there isn't anything, but either there isn't anything or they were unwilling to let me look at it. But I got nowhere. I mean, I sat for 2 days in the kitchen at Von Fried waiting for someone to let me have access to stuff, and she came back and says, sorry, you can't, or there isn't, or it was sort of one of those sorts of situations. So I don't know. We don't know. But I do think that, for instance, it may well be that this is something that Wagner had planned to use for Brunhilde and Götterdämmerung from before. It could also be that he composed it in 1871. I just don't know. But it could be. But the techniques that he used, the different way he treats the music, that cannot be been planned before. So the material itself can have been planned before, and even various specific things he did with the material might have been planned before. Some of it, I think, probably certainly was. But to what extent, how he does it, the actual, techniques, nuts and bolts, I think there's no way he could have planned before. So much water under the bridge. I mean, writing Tristan and Meistersinger, and for that matter, the Paris version of Tannhäuser too, were big things, big changes in his life. But I think ultimately, first thing, I don't think that Wagner could have gone on with the Ring. It's not a question that he decided. I think that he really had come to a point when, for a variety of reasons, most of which I think Simon gave us very accurately, Wagner had to let it go. And the Ring ultimately is richer for this 11-year break. It's certainly different, but I think it's also richer. Any other questions? I was going to address one thing, the specific thing that you had given me, about the Siegfried motive. Would you? Yeah. Let me read the passage, and I'll give you my. Yeah. Okay. This is from. There's a Wagner reading group amongst you guys, I guess, and they're reading Ring Resounding. I love this book, actually. The Derek book. It's full of misinformation. Now, I know too much, but anyway, I mean, it's factually, not the stuff, but factually stuff. But anyway, let me read this. When we were recording the passage of Siegfried and the Dragon, when he fights Fafnir, or rather the passage which immediately follows the death of Fafnir, I thought I spotted something which I had never noticed before in the Ring. The fact that it is precisely there that one hears the Siegfried motive for the first time with a drop of a seventh instead of a sixth in the middle of the phrase. Let me play this. Usually when we hear the Siegfried motive, we hear, when he plays this horn call, we hear it many, many times. That's a sixth. That's a sixth. That's because there's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 notes of the scale between them, so we call it a sixth. However, the place he's talking about, one specific place, when he names himself to Fafnir, we hear it with a drop of a seventh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's and it actually sounds quite different. That's the usual way. And the special way. But also, it moves to the major as it happens. It doesn't always. And then just to read on in the passage further, he discovers that it isn't. He thinks it's the first time, and it's not. When Brunhilde tells Sieglinde that she's pregnant and going to have a son, the first time we hear it, and on the very next page, what key is she in now? I've got to get to it. I don't have. Well, I do. I have the score. Here we go. Same key it starts. What am I talking about? I should. And that's when she gives him his name. And we're going to hear the so-called redemption motive for the first time right after that. So we actually have heard it before. Anyway, so it's not the first time. And we hear it in the funeral march that way also. He makes a reference to that also. There is, if you allow me just 1 second, there is some significance to this other than the fact that it sounds different. I don't need it. Thank you very much. On top, it's not only motives in the Ring that become associated with various sort of emotions or ideas. It's also more basic musical things. And this includes intervals. Interval is the distance between two notes. You just take two notes together. And a very simple example. If you hear in the Ring, when we hear, for instance, in the prelude of Act 1 of Siegfried, it ain't good, right? It's not good. If we hear it like this, it's even worse. And if we hear it like this, it's even worse still. I mean, it's but it's bad. It's a half step. We call that a half step. If it's a full step, that's good. This is bad. That's good. Okay. Okay, that one, one's happy, one's sad. I'm dealing on this level now. Really sort of simple stuff. In general, intervals, this is just minor and major seconds, in the ring have associations to some extent, subliminally. Excuse me, that's your word, not mine. Sixths in the ring, or they're both sixths, in general in the ring actually are associated with heroism, partly because of this motive, but actually because of this motive more than anything else. The Welsing stuff. I mean, there's a whole lot of music in the ring, also for that matter, that has this, it's based on this interval of a sixth. And in general, the sixth in the ring is generally sort of associated with heroism. Okay, just trust me, okay, for a second. Or you don't have to trust me, but just for now, trust me. And then you go home and show that I'm full of it. But still, for now, say trust me. Okay, the seventh, the interval of seventh, is a fairly unusual interval. You can hear why. It's hard to sing, for one thing. We don't hear it a lot in the ring. So there is some music in the ring that features it. For instance, you hear that, right? Or anybody have any remember where that either of those come from? The first one is Fricka and Wotan, and that's scene 2 of Rheingold. It has something to do with Fricka. Or when Fricka says that she wants to, if she had the ring, she'd be so attractive that Wotan would not stray to other women. We hear that, for instance, and Loga plays up on that. And the second one I played, it's another sort of more beautiful form of it, is Siegfried at the top of the fire. We'll hear that tomorrow night. We'll hear Act 3 of Siegfried, or Act 2 afternoon, I guess. That's when he sees, he doesn't know she's a woman yet, but sees her lying there, I suppose. Some association with women. Well, what about this? This is another one that we associate with it. Same as the seventh. What's that? We're just about there. Yeah, right. Sieglinde sings it the first time. It's what all of us used to call the redemption motive when we were kids, and Wagner calls In Praise of Brunhilde. Wagner actually gave that motive a name in a letter, and he called it In Praise of Brunhilde. In any case, okay, we hear it, it's the last motive we hear in the ring, right? At the very end of the ring. That's a seventh. Okay, so whatever, whereas I would say sixth has to do with heroism, seventh is, but anyway, that's a seventh. There's another one. What about this? It's Brunhilde. And Wagner will use the fact that both one form of the Siegfried motive and this particular Brunhilde motive both have that dropping seventh. At the end of the immolation scene, we're going to hear those motives on top of each other, where you can't really quite tell whether it's going to be the Siegfried motive or the redemption motive, we used to call it. We'll just call it that for now, for as good as anything else. So maybe you could say the sevenths have to do with redemption, or maybe they have to do with the eternal feminine, which I think is more to the point, probably. But in any case, the fact that the Siegfried motive